Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos weekly as a companion to go along with a Bible study that we are doing in my congregation based on something called The Story. Sort of looks like that. The Story is a condensed Bible narrative put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee that is aimed at bringing the overarching story of what God's up to from the beginning to the end down into an approachable, more manageable story. Takes the narrative and really condenses down. Takes out a lot of the other types of writings that are present within the Bible that sometimes we can kind of get bogged down in, and just really presents the narrative within that form. So that's kind of what the story is. And as I mentioned, we have been studying this weekly within my congregation, and so I put these videos together for those who were unable to make it to the discussion, the study and the discussion time. This particular week, we took a look at chapter 26, which is entitled The Hour of Darkness. Now, this chapter is aimed at basically everything from the Last Supper through Jesus' death on the cross. And we're kind of looking at what's estimated to be about a 24 to maybe 36-hour period at the tail end of Holy Week. Pretty much everything that we looked at within this particular chapter is associated with Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. And that's kind of the way that, or the time period that we're looking at. So kind of right in that last little portion of Holy Week leading into Easter, which the resurrection will be our focus for next week. But to start off with, just a quick word about the notion of calendar or days of the week. That's different from how we think about it now compared to how it was seen within the Jewish culture at the time of Jesus. And this is important because it kind of plays into some of the whole like this day and the next day and the next day type situations. For us, we tend to think of a day. It starts at midnight and runs all the way through to the following midnight. So we've got that 24-hour period that goes from the middle of the night and through the early morning, and then through the regular morning, and then noon, and then through the afternoon and the evening, and then through the first part of the night until midnight again. That's a day. And that's how things work for us. Now, in Jesus' time, in the Jewish reckoning, the day ended basically when the sun went down, and the next day began. So rather than for us, we think of morning, afternoon, evening, night. They would reckon basically the start of a day is the night. You go through the night and then through the day, and then that day ends at sundown. So, for instance, I'm recording this on Wednesday. So for them, Wednesday would have started Tuesday night as soon as the sun went down, and will be in Wednesday until the sun goes down tonight, in which case Thursday will begin. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that sheds a little bit of light and understanding. Now, I bring all this up because, of course, as we start talking about Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and this day, and that day, and what day, and every day, it can get a little confusing when we start to think about that. And this is important because as we look at the different Gospels, we've got the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and they all present things pretty similar. There's little details that are different, but overarching, they're pretty similar. But John shifts the action forward about a day to where Jesus is killed on the day of preparation. That being said, I should back up for just a second here. Now, of course, Holy Week occurs during the festival of Passover. That's why Jesus is in Jerusalem. That's why so many Jewish people are in Jerusalem, because that's one of their major festivals, and Passover is really the big time festival. So there's tons and tons of people there. There's extra Roman presence there to kind of keep an eye on the people. That's why Pilate is there, for he's the governor of that region. That's probably why Herod is there. We hear that Herod is there within some of the Gospels, all because of it's this big, huge, biggest of the big Jewish festival. So everybody's there, including Jesus and the disciples. And so we have all this different action going on. Now, the way Passover works, there's the day of preparation when the lambs are slaughtered. and that goes on during the day. If we were to think about this like Maundy Thursday, it happens during the day, and then there's the Passover meal is eaten after sundown, so it's eaten that night. So it's still like we would think of as Thursday, but it's now going into Friday. So even though for us in our reckoning we're still within this 124-hour period, so a day for us it's kind of almost like 2 days. The day of preparation is in the morning of Thursday, and then the Passover meal is eaten that night after sun has fallen. So for them it's now Friday, which then will lead into Saturday, which is the Sabbath, and then into Sunday, which is the first day of the week when Jesus is resurrected. So that's kind of where we're at. But as I mentioned, John shifts the action forward to where Jesus dies. Jesus is crucified on the day of preparation, which would be Thursday for us. So for that, the Last Supper in John actually is Wednesday night. So Wednesday night into Thursday, he dies on Thursday, is in the tomb on Friday, and then Saturday, and then is raised on Sunday. The Synoptic Gospels, of course, shifts everything back, and the Passover meal is the Last Supper, and so we see that going on. So basically, there's the day of preparation, which we hear about, and then they have the Last Supper, and then they go out to the garden where Jesus is arrested, and this is all through the night, Thursday night into Friday, and then the trial and the crucifixion happens on Friday, and he dies Friday and is in the tomb on Saturday, which is the second day, and is raised on Sunday on the third day. So we see the all four Gospels come back together on the resurrection end, and they all agree that it's the first day of the week, which is Sunday. What gets a little bit skewed or a little bit different is that Jesus dies a day earlier in John on the day of preparation, giving us the notion that Jesus is the ultimate sacrificial lamb, that he is sacrificed with all the lambs for the Passover and dies. And just as their death and sacrifice painted the blood over the doors of the Israelites when they were in Egypt at the original Passover, and God passed over that house and no one died there, hence the beginning of Passover. Likewise, Jesus' ultimate sacrifice and his blood spilled on the cross is for all of us, so that God passes over the punishment, the sin, the death, all of that. Okay, so that's kind of a whole lot of background for what's all going into this chapter. But I shared all that because we talked about that and at quite a bit to length about that and these little minor differences and why they're in there and what's significant about them and so on and so forth. Again, the major things that go on within this chapter, we have the preparation for the Last Supper or for the Passover meal, and then the Last Supper itself. From there, they go out to the garden, and we see Jesus praying in the garden when he is asking, Lord, let this cup pass from my lips, and the anxiety and the anguish that he's feeling. And we talked quite a bit about that and what exactly is the anguish over? What is he fearing? And then his arrest, then into the trial and the crucifixion. And those are kind of the major points that come up within this chapter. It's a mixture of all four Gospels, which I think I may have mentioned before, although John and Matthew are featured the most prominently within this chapter. Luke and Mark have some little snippets here and there, so they're in there, but mostly Matthew and John are kind of the big two that we see here. As we kind of go, the first thing that we kind of talked about is, of course, the Last Supper. And we see within the chapter both aspects. Now, John at the Last Supper doesn't feature the notion of communion like we have in the other three. With he takes the bread and he breaks it, and this is my body broken for you. Do this for remembrance of me. Sorry, I had to wipe my nose there. And then likewise with the wine in the cup. That's present in the Synoptics, and that's within the chapter. But we also have John's account where that's not really there at all. And we see the foot washing, and we talked some about why that difference, why that ambiguity, and is it possible that actually both of these suppers happened, and I think so, and that all of these events happened. Well, did Jesus wash the disciples' feet? Yes, he did. And why did he do that? And regardless of if they happen on two different days or if it all happened in the context of the one Last Supper, whichever day that was, um, it, I don't think that really matters. What matters is that it all happened. And in Jesus taking on the role of the slave, taking on the role of the servant, the ultimate servant. And we talked some about what does the foot washing signify? And it's humbling himself to the point of being a servant, taking on the role of the lowest of the low. Within a household, it would have been the lowest of the low of the low servants is tasked with washing the feet of the guests. And certainly the master of the house would never do it, and certainly the rabbi would never do it for his followers. And yet that's exactly what we see happens. Jesus humbles himself and sets an example for the disciples of as you have seen me do this, now you must do this for one another. Humble yourself, serve one another. That's what this is all about. Love each other by serving one another. And then we do have some aspects of the words of institution of instituting communion. And one thing we focused on, or a little side comment, is Jesus says, truly I will never drink of the fruit of the vine again until I drink it new with you in the kingdom of heaven. And we kind of gleamed onto that for just a little bit, and that's interesting. That's Jesus giving us insight that there will one day be the new heaven and the new earth, whatever that's going to look like in the last days after Jesus comes back again. And so he will once again, like he communed with his disciples there, but he's saying, I will not do this again until it is new within the new kingdom, or the kingdom of heaven, telling us that he will once again be in communion with us. He will once again be in relationship with us, but it will be new. It will be something different. So we talked some about that. After that, there's a long period of kind of teaching and prayer that goes on within John's gospel. It's a pretty lengthy portion. It's several chapters of John's gospel between the foot washing and when when they go out to the garden. And one of the other things that we talked about is the whole encounter with Judas that happens there, and as well as the encounter with the beloved disciple. Now that's a kind of a big figure within John's gospel, and we don't know exactly who that beloved disciple is. Most people think it tends to think that it's John. Some people have speculated that the beloved disciple might be Lazarus. Now, still other people have postulated, that's a big word, have stated that the beloved disciple is you. As you are reading this, you are the one who is in the heart of Jesus. You are that beloved disciple. Which I like that notion, and I think there's some merit there, but I think the beloved disciple was also a specific person, but who we don't exactly know. But Jesus is talking about being betrayed again, and he says to the disciples, one of you will betray me. We know it to be Judas, and Peter is sitting across the table, or reclining. Got to keep in mind they were reclining on the floor, and the table was only about yay high off the ground. But so he's across the table, and he motions to the disciple, the beloved disciple, who's basically laying right up against Jesus, like, ask him who it's going to be. And so the beloved disciple does, and he says, whether he says it aloud or whether he just says it right back to that one individual, we don't know, and it doesn't tell us, but it's the one that I dip the bread in, or dip this bread and give it to. And he gives it to Judas. And then when Jesus receives the bread, we hear that Satan enters him, and Jesus tells him, whatever you need to do, go do it. And he goes out, and it's nighttime, and darkness has fallen, and because it's the darkness of the world is finally coming around Jesus, and his hour has come. So we talked quite a bit about that. We talked about Judas's ultimate his ultimate end game and what became of Judas. We know that he dies. One gospel says that he basically falls down and his body bursts open. The other one says, others say that he hangs himself. But Judas dies. But we think, what's his eternal goal, or what's his eternal outcome? And we don't know. Some things kind of point towards, well, maybe he could be forgiven for his part in this. Others kind of point towards, well, it's pretty bad for him, so we don't know. But so we talked some about that whole situation and what was prompting him. Moving on from there, we went into a little bit of discussion about what went on in the garden, but not much. We kind of glossed over that quite a bit in the arrest And we moved then more into talking about some about the trial and kind of a rigged deal, and interestingly enough, that all the different things that are going on and who's pulling strings and who's responsible and who's not responsible, and who did it and who didn't do it. Um, we talked about Pilate and his desire to. He was kind of between a rock and a hard place. He didn't want to crucify Jesus. Didn't see any reason for it and tried to let him go several times over, but also kind of caved to the whim of the crowd. Interestingly enough, as we think about Jesus' trial, kind of almost has two trials. He has one with the religious leaders at the temple, the chief priests and everything, and there his crime is blasphemy. He claims to be the Son of God, or he claims to be God, and no one can do that, so stone him. That's what the law says. And then they take him over to Pilate because they apparently don't have the authority to do that. So they take him to Pilate, and then the charge is insurrection, which is ultimately what Jesus is crucified for in the long run. Crucifixion is the perfect method of make an example, torture, kill. And so insurrectionists would be crucified. They're hung up where they're in agony for hours upon hours upon hours, and they're left there as an example of this is what happens to you if you defy Rome. And that is the charge that's brought against Jesus. Ultimately, what he's killed for, even though Pilate knows it's a load of hooey. But that's what's going on. Side note, we have Barabbas, who is the one who was released at the request of the people when Pilate's like, who should I release? Because that's the custom. Should I release Barabbas or Jesus? And they asked for Barabbas. Barabbas' crime, insurrection. So Jesus, this is a perfect example of Jesus literally dying for the sins of another. And he is excused, and Jesus takes the punishment for it. That's just a little side note, but it's an important one. Finally, we kind of went into talking about crucifixion and the curse that Jesus took upon himself, and the curse of all people, the punishment of all people. And finally, we discussed some of the anguish, and I think I mentioned that earlier, the anguish that Jesus is feeling, particularly in the garden. And what's that geared towards? Is it geared towards the torture that he knows is coming? To a certain extent, yes, I think it probably did. But more so, we get the notion that Jesus his anxiety, this great torture, this great pain, suffering, whatever you want to call it, that's about to come upon him, is the separation that he will feel from the Father. Jesus is God. He was with God in the beginning. He is the Word of God. He is the Word made flesh. He is God the Son. However you want to look at it, he is part of God. He knows oneness with God and has throughout his lifetime. And he knows that in his death, he will experience that separation from God. And I think that is what he's ultimately so up in arms about, of let this pass from my lips. Do not let me be separated from you. And yet that's exactly what needs to happen and what ultimately does happen. So that's kind of a lot of the stuff that we talked about within this chapter and within our discussion last night. It was a very lively discussion, a lot of different ideas and notions and questions flying around. So that was really, really great. But if you have thoughts, questions, comments after reading the chapter and seeing this video, please by all means share them down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week and God bless.